Welcome to the Acton Line podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Today we are bringing you a conversation with Stephanie Slade, the managing editor of Reason, and Eric Kohn, the director of communication here at Acton. In this episode, they discuss the philosophy of fusionism. Slade writes that fusionism is the marriage of two value sets, liberty and virtue. Liberty, in the classical sense of freedom from aggression, coercion, and fraud, and virtue, in the Judeo-Christian sense of submission to God's commands. In this unifying value set, we can see fusionism as a distinct philosophical orientation unto itself. Rather than a tug of war between two philosophies, which we see played out today, fusionism introduces the idea that liberty and virtue should have never been separated. With fusionism, we see this unbreakable bond between the two, where people can freely choose to live out their individual rights and freely live out teachings of Christianity. The Founding Fathers believed that virtue and liberty were, according to Slade, mutually reinforcing, and that neither could survive long without the other. A free society depends on a virtuous populace. The question we explore in this episode is this: if a free society requires morality, how do we live virtuously in an age that rejects it? You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
I'm joined today by Stephanie Slade, who is the managing editor of Reason and author of the new piece in the most recent edition of the magazine, Is There a Future for Fusionism? Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me back.
So let's start definitionally. What is, by your lights, fusionism? How do you define it? And what is, I guess, the short history of it?
I think it actually helps to begin by saying what it is not and what the conventional wisdom is about fusionism that I kind of am trying to debunk in this article. There's a story that a lot of people have heard that says that fusionism is a sort of name for what happened during the Cold War era, when both religious traditionalists and libertarians came together under one tent and formed a coalition or an alliance because both felt that they had this common enemy in the Soviet Union that they were both against. And so that having that common enemy brought these two camps together and held them together. And of course, the Soviet Union was both atheistic, which was a problem for the religious traditionalist camp, and it was also anti-capitalistic. And so that was a problem for the libertarian camp. So they were willing to sort of cooperate with each other and even sometimes cede ground to each other in order to put up a strong front against the Soviet Union and the sort of rampaging threat of communism. That's the conventional story you often hear. And then it ends by saying something like, well, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the glue that held this coalition together went away. And so it should come as no surprise that the alliance between religious traditionalists and libertarians has been sort of disintegrating in the last couple of decades, and that is epitomized in the last few years by the rise of Trump and the rise of this sort of post-liberal big government conservatism that you're hearing a lot of it, getting a lot of attention on the right, because there's no reason for the religious traditionalists, for example, to sort of have an alliance with the libertarians anymore. They don't need to stand strong against the Soviet Union anymore. I think that story is wrong because I think that it is a mistake to describe fusionism as an alliance of two separate groups, and it is much more helpful to think of fusionism as a separate philosophical orientation unto itself. It's not just a pragmatic bringing together of religious traditionalists and libertarians, but it is rather the orientation held by people who think that both virtue and liberty are important, and who want to find a way to sort of bring those two together in one philosophical, not just one practical or, coalitional camp, but one coherent, independent philosophical outlook.
Would you draw some kind of a distinction between what you're defining there as fusionism and what I guess could perhaps be otherwise termed the Reagan Coalition? So as I've typically heard fusionism defined, it's not just two camps, it's three. So you have your individualists or libertarians or the economic libertarians, pro-capitalist types. That's one camp or one leg of the stool. You have the traditionalists or social conservatives. And the third are foreign policy hawks, which I think draws in the part about the Soviet Union more. Do you think that coalition, which I think could be argued, certainly predated Reagan's ascendancy to the presidency, and would probably, in terms of the timeline, I think, track with the history of fusionism from the founding of National Review, if that's going to kind of where we're going to peg the start of it. Do you separate those two things out at all, or do you not think that the foreign policy element of it was or should be as pronounced or considered within this definition of fusionism?
I definitely separate them. That doesn't mean that the phenomenon of this sort of Reaganite three-legged stool wasn't a real thing. I mean, that was a real phenomenon. And, if you are a real nerd who studies the history of the founding of National Review magazine, you'll find that actually William F. Buckley went out and explicitly, intentionally recruited contributing editors from each of those three camps to represent these different views, the sort of Cold War hawk, military strength, national security view, the religious traditionalist view, and the sort of economic libertarian view. He wanted to bring those all together and under the banner of National Review and this conservative movement that he was helping to build. And that's a real phenomenon that happened. But yeah, my position is that is not fusionism. And actually that the word fusionism refers to something different, which is a philosophy that actually has its roots much, much farther back, even than 1955 and the founding of National Review and William F. Buckley. That the American founders were in a broad sense fusionists. They believed that both liberty and virtue were very important, and that as they were trying to figure out how to found a new society and structure this new government, they were thinking, how do we promote and protect both of these incredibly important, these two pillars, these incredibly important pillars. And so I don't think that they really thought of national security as being an important part of that project. I mean, it's sort of it's a secondary concern. If you're going to have a society where people are free, you can't be sort of vulnerable to external threats, of course. But these two important values were very, very important and motivating to the founders. And to conservatives in the American tradition, which I differentiate sort of from the old school European conservative tradition, this is the core of what it means to be a conservative in America for centuries. Was we think that both the Judeo-Christian understanding of virtue, but also the very preeminent importance of individual liberty and individual rights, we need to be able to find a way to protect and promote both of those things. It was not until I think the Frank Meyer, William F. Buckley era in the 20th century before this idea was refined of how do you do that? How do we, these things seem to be in tension with each other. How do we protect both these things? How do we figure out how to balance them against each other? And I think that the modern 20th century fusionists are the ones who made some advances in sort of giving us a framework that I find very persuasive and compelling for how to do that.
In a way, you may have at least partially answered this next question already, but I know you had a conversation with Jonah Goldberg on his podcast, and I believe he raised this same point that referencing a essay in National Affairs a few issues ago by a political scientist named Daniel Burns, where he made distinctions between liberalism in theory and liberalism in practice. And that if we look around, there aren't societies that we would say are purely Lockean, that embody that kind of liberalism in theory, in practice. But we have liberal societies in practice. Do you think that Reaganite coalition, or what you were just discussing, is perhaps the distinction to be made there is between fusionism in theory or philosophy, which you're discussing in your piece, and then fusionism in practice as formed as a political coalition based around, in that particular case, a common enemy in the Soviet Union?
I don't think so. I would not go that far. And the reason is because, I just think that we are misunderstanding and we're sort of hurting the fusionist cause if we talk in terms of coalition building and alliances. Because my argument, my position is that a fusionist is a person who thinks that these things are both important. And that is what a fusionist is: virtue and liberty, both important. And the way, and sort of, again, in the modern era, we have sort of the framework we have developed or to explain how you can make how you can sort of have two priorities. There's the old saying, if you have two priorities, then you have no priorities because you can only have one first priority. Well, the answer they came up with was that the government exists to protect individual rights and liberties, and that is the sort of highest end of the government and the public policy sphere. But in the vast space outside of government, in all the decisions we make in our private lives, it's individuals, it's families, it's communities. The highest end is virtue. We are put on this earth to pursue the higher things, and that means virtue, and it means also a sort of constellation of other values like faith and family and community, patriotism even. That you kind of have to have these two spheres in your mind and recognize that there's two spheres of life, and they each exist to give us space to pursue one or the other of the two high values, these two pillars of fusionism. That's a person can, I mean, I am a person who thinks that those two values are both incredibly important, and I'm not willing to sacrifice either one of them. But there are people out there, in our political environment who are non-fusionist libertarians or who are non-fusionist conservatives who maybe only think that liberty or virtue is the highest value and want that value to be the end that is pursued in all the spheres of life. Those people are not fusionists, right? And I actually think that recognizing that distinction is important for understanding how to engage with them if for those of us who are fusionists.
It would seem to me that the inclination towards fusionism in our politics and way of thinking about the life of the nation is declining. So we'll take it out of coalitional terms and put it back into philosophical terms. Why do you think we have seen this decline in the inclination towards fusionism as a kind of a guiding philosophy for a lot of actors on what we would, I think, largely term the political right?
I think we're seeing a backlash right now against some overreach and some illiberalism on the left in the last decade or so, such that there are a lot of people who maybe they were maybe not totally committed to the fusionist position, but they were sort of under the fusionist banner before, but who really identify with the religious traditionalist side of that equation, who are saying, well, if they're not playing by the rules of treating the government as existing to protect individual rights and liberties only, if they're instead trying to use the government as a weapon or as a tool, to wield the government as a weapon in order to punish people who disagrey with them and force society as a whole into the mold that they want to see. So, people are looking out and they're seeing real efforts by liberal folks on the left to pass laws that say that Catholic hospitals have to perform abortions, that, Christian bakers have to participate in a gay wedding. There's also this sort of sense of runaway PC culture, political correctness run amok. And the idea that anybody who looks, who is a Christian, who believes the things that Christians believe or sort of generally accepts the Judeo-Christian values is an enemy in the eyes of these folks. And they're willing on the left, and they're willing to use the power of the state to come after us. They say, well, then why should we play by the rules if they're not playing by the rules? And they're willing to sacrifice the pillar that, if I talked about the two pillars of fusionism, the pillar that says the state exists to protect individual rights and liberties only, and that's it. It's limited there. Anything beyond that would be an inappropriate use of the state. They're saying the other side isn't accepting that rule, so why should we? I think that's wrong. I think that's a huge mistake, if for no other reason than from a moral perspective. If we actually believe if we actually believe that the other side is doing something wrong, then we shouldn't emulate them. We should double down on the things that we think are right. But I can understand where the sense of being under attack and the left isn't playing by the rules, so why should we play by the rules? Or they're fighting with fire, so we have to fight them with fire. I understand where that impulse comes from. I think it is a mistake, though.
I suppose the argument against that would be ceding everything that you said about the PC culture, about the actions of the left and all of that, this is, I suppose, the conservatism hasn't conserved anything argument, that we're watching these institutions continually move to the left, that we're watching them become more radical in that sense. And if we're not going to use the mechanisms that they are willing to use against us, well, then what do those mechanisms even exist for? That hectoring them about a limited role for the state, well, the state has grown incredibly powerful. And if we're not going to use it ourselves, then it's just going to be used against us. How do you answer that critique?
Well, I think that actually the liberal institutions of society and of government have been a pretty strong bulwark against many of these attempts at overreach by the left. So I'm not saying that the threats aren't real. I obviously write about them, for a living, but the Supreme Court has fairly consistently come down on the side of religious liberty, free speech, the protection of these values against assaults from the left. Think of the Hobby Lobby court case where the Obama administration wanted to require employers to pay for birth control and abortifacient products for all their employers free of charge. This is a private company. The Hobby Lobby is a chain of craft stores. It is owned by a family, a Christian family, the Green family, and they said, we object on religious grounds and, on conscience-based grounds to this requirement. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the family against the Obama administration and said, this is a family-owned business. They cannot be required to do something that violates their religious liberty rights, their First Amendment rights. There are many examples of the courts and of our sort of liberal institutions getting it right when we let them. But as soon as you say, well, actually, it's all just about who has power, and anything goes if you're the ones in power, then there's no credibility for those institutions to take the sort of principled stand, even when it runs against the people with power. In that case, it was the court standing up against the Obama administration, the people with power, on the basis of principle. The First Amendment holds, whether even if you think it's inconvenient or unfair that women have to pay for their own birth control. The institutions can go a long way, but we undermine their credibility if we treat them just, again, as weapons that can be wielded and put down, and as it's convenient for our political ends, as opposed to enduring institutions that represent principles that matter and that are of higher importance than any given political end.
I think the record is pretty clear that you're right, especially when it comes to legal protections. The Hobby Lobby case was a victory from a religious liberty standpoint, that every time the Little Sisters of the Poor have come up before the Supreme Court, they've been victorious 3 times so far, and probably likely a 4th in the coming years. But I think the critics would point to that and say, therein lies the problem. 4 times now, this order of nuns has been dragged before the United States Supreme Court to defend something that, go back maybe even just 20 years, certainly 30, 40 years, wouldn't even really have been a question. I think this points to the difference between the state side of things, where I think it's very clear those protections against the state and against other actors for religious liberty are there and they're working. But that there's a cultural battle that these people feel has largely been lost, or if not completely lost, then they are certainly losing it. I think they feel, I'm assuming a lot here, so I will admit that, about what their motivations are, people who would argue against the position you're taking, that they feel without any weapon to fight the culture war that they've lost, and they don't know what tools to pick up in order to fight that battle, in lieu of picking up the heavy hand of the state in order to try to reclaim what they think they've lost in the cultural sphere.
No, you're right about that. And there's no question that, conservatives, religious traditionalists who feel that the elite culture-making institutions of our country, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, academia, the mainstream media, are against them. That's not false. They're not wrong about that. But this is why it's really, I think, helpful to begin by having in your mind the idea of these two spheres, the government sphere and the non-governmental sphere, the public policy sphere and everything else. None of those battles that conservatives feel like they've lost are taking place in the governmental sphere. This is civil society. And if conservatives and religious traditionalists are losing there, to me, that's a sign that they need to do better, and maybe they need to re-engage in those areas, and they need to pull some of their focus away from winning elections and move their focus into institution building, civil society institution building. So if as a society we have sort of, religiosity is declining. You have marriage rates are down, divorce rates are up. Like, there are all these things that traditional conservatives would say are troubling. You have the opioid crisis, of course. What are you doing about it? We all have an obligation to try to solve these problems individually and in as community members. And the left is sort of winning those battles in a way because they have done a really good job of institution building. And I think the right has not. The right has been more focused on, and there have been successes. The Republican Party, has held state governments and has, up until recently had a lot of success at the federal government level, this last election being a sort of outlier. So I guess the point that I want to make is that, especially as conservatives, we should recognize that there are more important things in life than public power, government power. There are much more important things in life. The larger and more important aspects of our lives happen outside of public policy. And so, what are we doing to make sure that the values we care about, if virtue in this traditional sense is a thing we feel like our society has lost, what are we doing to address that?
Let me challenge you on one thing you said there. So the idea that they haven't been losing within the public policy or governmental sphere. Am I correctly remembering what you had said in that answer? I'm not attributing something there to you.
Well, there has been a lot of success among conservatives. So again,
okay,
I wouldn't say that, obviously Obama was president for 8 years. He did a lot of things we don't like. So I'm not trying to overstate the case.
Sure. So let me put this to you then. And I'm going to draw a little bit from my own insistence, I guess, that there is a clear coalitional aspect to fusionism, which we've already covered, but just allow me that for the purpose of this question. It is largely attributed, as you said, that the death knell of this kind of at least coalitional fusionism or Reaganite coalition was the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. I tend to think that it was something different. Looking back, I think that may have been the beginning of it, but the thing that expedited the kind of political coalition cleaving that we're seeing and that we have seen was the fight over gay marriage. That we had in 2004, we have state constitutional amendments against gay marriage being a primary part of George W. Bush's reelection strategy. And 11 years later, you have the Obergefell decision, which set aside the public policy question in and of itself, was a very unconservative in the rapid pace at which we moved from one way things were to the things being completely different. And as a result, I think you're looking at people, certainly in the traditionalist camp of the fusionist coalition, or the virtue pillar, I think would probably be the part of it from a philosophical standpoint, and seeing that they lost a public policy battle there, and then watched, I think they would describe, I can't remember who it was who said this, the people who won that battle then scour the battlefield and shooting the wounded. The manifestation of that being the cake baker in Colorado and issues like that. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think that loss in a public policy space and a cultural space simultaneously points to why we're experiencing this coalitional or philosophical cleaving of the American right?
I think you've actually got it exactly backwards. The conservatives lost the cultural battle there, and the public policy inevitably follows. But it wasn't just 2004. In 2008, my home state of Florida passed a gay marriage ban. In 2011, Barack Obama was still on the record opposed to gay marriage. The thing that changed, and there's this great graph that you can find of Pew Research Center or Gallup data showing support for gay marriage. And almost immediately after the support ticks above 50% nationally for gay marriage, Obama announced that he had an evolution in his views on this question. Politics, follows culture on these things. The problem is that conservatives lost the cultural battle, that public opinion changed, and it changed rapidly. And that was a sort of PR success for gay marriage and gay rights advocates. We actually at Reason a few years ago, we published a piece by Jonathan Rauch in which he talked about how the strategy that they used to try to humanize what they were asking for in terms of equal rights, marriage rights. And I think it was successful. I think, and they used the sort of pop culture, you turn on TV and you find Will and Grace or get, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy or whatever. They used all these sort of pieces of civil society institutions that they were working through in order to try to change the culture, and they succeeded, and the law followed. Now, what happened after that, what you described about shooting survivors on the battlefield, is extremely problematic. But that's now we're back in we're sort of back in the zone of public policy again, because they're trying to use the state to go after people. And here, I think we still, we as conservatives in this moment especially need our classical liberal governing institutions that will stay strong when it comes to defending these individual rights and liberties, as opposed to woke sort of leftist understanding of virtue and imposing that on people, which is how many people on the left would like the state to be used.
You write for a libertarian magazine. Do you think that libertarians would be correctly defined as being on the right?
Well, this is a major debate among, in libertarian world. Libertarians love to fight with each other about things like this. And there are people who identify as left libertarians. I consider myself to be on the right. There are some people, I would say some of my colleagues probably would reject the idea that they're either left or right. They don't want to be, it's a very libertarian thing to not want to be branded with either label. I would say, though, that one of the reasons I consider, Reason, for example, to be more or less on the right of center is because of our view on economic policy. And so we're clearly in favor of free markets. Free minds and free markets is the tagline of Reason. This is a thing that differentiates us from, the politics of the left in a way that is often appears to be kind of an unbridgeable divide. Most people on the left just do not want to work with libertarians because of our views on economic policy and our desire to keep the government out of the economy. And so I think we've naturally found a more comfortable home on the right. But that's, of course, right now in this moment, the moment in which post-liberal conservatism is getting a lot of traction, there is a question about whether that will continue.
Well, I think even perhaps more so than the questions of economic policy, although it feeds into this, is the view of the role of the state that you've articulated, that for most of its history, although certainly the conservatives would have a more robust view of the state, although certainly throughout the previous rewind at least 20 years, a less robust view of the state than many of them seem to now, that the idea that the role of the state is as limited as humanly possible is the thing that knits it together. I think that would probably largely be true in terms of the intersection between libertarians. Again, we're generalizing on both of those camps because there are a lot of, it just like when you talk about music, you have general genres of music and then so many subgenres that it's almost impossible to keep them all straight. But there seems to have been in recent years as well a inclination amongst libertarians to have more of an alliance with the left, if we assume, again, the coalitional idea of fusionism being a alliance with libertarians or individualists, as they would have been called then, with the right. What do you think is the tenability of political coalition building with the political left amongst libertarians?
Well, I'm all for it. Again, I don't think that this is. I think thinking of fusionism in the same conflating fusionism, which I consider to be a philosophy or a philosophical orientation, with the sort of nitty-gritty political coalition building is a mistake. But I'm all for working with people on the left when there's an opportunity to do so. Libertarians have always, it's this long-running sense of frustration that we have always had, that we care very deeply about things like ending the drug war and promoting criminal justice reform. And it really seems to us that there should be natural allies on these issues on the left, more than sort of the law and order conservatives on the right, who may be a little more skeptical of these positions. And to some extent, we have done some of that bridge building to the left on these issues in recent years. But it's been harder than we maybe would have thought it should be. And again, I think that's because of the distrust they feel towards us because of our views on economics. So, but one of the things I've said a couple of times is that as we're thinking in terms of the schism that has opened up along the fault line of liberalism, that it is a schism that runs across both left and right. So there are people who are on the left of center, who are on what I would consider to be the liberal side of the schism, and there are people who are left of center who are on the illiberal side. And the same is true on the right. There are people who are on the right who are nonetheless liberal, classical liberal conservatives, and there are these illiberal or post-liberal conservatives. And when you start thinking in those terms, you can at least conceptualize why it might make sense for people who are on the correct, what I would consider to be the correct side of the liberalism schism, whether left or right, to be looking to each other as potential allies. Because at some point, I mean, I think for me, I really struggle to imagine a world in which I have the ability to work closely with the sort of post-liberal or illiberal conservatives, people who are on the wrong side of the liberalism divide. That's much harder for me to imagine building bridges with, at least when it comes to public policy, as opposed to somebody who's maybe what I think of as the old school ACLU liberal, the kind of person who's left of center but believes very deeply in civil rights and individual rights and liberties, the First Amendment. Now, this of course is complicated by the fact that the ACLU today has decided that, if you want to exercise your Second Amendment rights, you have to forfeit your First Amendment rights or something. But that's why the old school left, liberal, the old school left liberals and the sort of fusionist conservatives, I think there is opportunity to potentially for us to work together on things. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing so many people. I think I mentioned this before, but in the last year, we've seen all these people who were left of center journalists, writers, thinkers, leave mainstream media publications, mainstream media outlets, and go independent. They start their own Substack newsletters or podcasts and things like that. And the reason is because although they're left of center, they feel like these institutions that they were associated with are increasingly on the wrong side of the liberalism divide. And so they're looking for a new home. And so there are just opportunities here, I think. Whether they'll actually turn into anything, I don't know. But the opportunities are there.
Stephanie Slade is managing editor of Reason, and her piece, Is There a Future for Fusionism, appears in the most recent edition of Reason magazine. We'll also put a link to it in the show notes for this episode. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.